Hey everyone, so I think we're ready to get started. So I first want to thank all of you guys for joining us for this webinar today. The focus of the webinar is Remediation Insights. What can years of data from thousands of projects tell us? My name is Chris Wade and I'll be the host. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with who ENFOS is, we're a cloud software platform that exists to help companies manage all of the complexities involved in both remediation and decommissioning. Everything from the financial to the technical aspects and everything in between. So for today's webinar, we're going to be discussing the topics listed on your screen. Since all of our attendees are muted for this webinar, you'll be able to submit questions throughout the webinar via the chat box. So we're going to try to answer those live at the end of the webinar. And for those whose questions do not get answered today, we're going to be answering those through a follow-up email. We welcome all issues of discussion, so please do not hesitate to send in any questions. And today's webinar will also be recorded and made available to all attendees within the next few days. We're going to also be publishing the recording on our YouTube page. So a bit about our speaker. Roger Well co-founded ENFOS back in October of 2000. So he's the Vice President and the Chief Operating Officer with 29 years of experience in the field. And with that, I'm pleased to hand it over to Roger.
So our topic today is business intelligence. And we want to start out with a few minutes, kind of an overview and a normalization to get everyone somewhat on the same page here. Business intelligence, or we'll use the acronym BI, it's one of those terms that if you were to ask 100 people how to define it, you're going to get 100 different answers. So today it'll be ENFOS's turn to help provide an answer from our perspective, and then you guys can take that and reword it or redefine it however your organization might. But we think that we have a pretty good line of sight on it based on customers in the remediation market. Before we get into the definition then and that overview, I want to let everyone know why BI is so important to ENFOS. First of all, it's important to us because it's important to our customers. Our customers are demanding more value from their data, and they're demanding more flexibility in their reporting, and that includes both standard reporting as well as custom or ad hoc reporting. So that's the first reason. The second reason it's important to us is that remediation is not getting easier, as we all know. In fact, it's getting harder because we're left with the persistent contaminants, the sites that are very complex, and most of the low-hanging fruit for no further actions or closures. We've achieved that already as an industry. So remediation is getting tougher, and we believe that BI is an important element moving forward. So that's the second. And then the third reason is definitely self-serving. But the third reason that BI is important to ENFOS is that it fits our overall software design philosophy of managing everything in one place. If you're an existing ENFOS customer or user, you probably have heard that from us before, but managing everything in one place is very important to us. And we do that because we believe in data in context. That is, that combining your site information, that's your projects and your sites and your portfolio, combining that information with both your technical and your financial information gives you increased visibility and better decision making for the teams that are attempting to manage these environmental liabilities. So those are the reasons why this is very important to us. So from a definition standpoint, remember, you'll get a lot of different answers, but a lot of them have the same components. So we look at really this quadrant when we define it, and if you start in the upper left, that's technology, and then you go to data, then you go to insights, and then you go to action. So the definition that we like to use is that BI is using technology to convert data into insights so that your teams can take better decisions, they can make better decisions, and take more effective actions. So a few things to keep in mind there. In the technology quadrant, technology is improving on a rapid basis. And information technology, not only around business intelligence, but also machine learning and artificial intelligence, is growing very, very quickly. The remediation industry overall is probably somewhat of a late adapter into these higher, more mature technologies. That doesn't mean it's too late, though. It's just that there are other business functions that have leveraged BI already, and they're probably moving ahead more into the AI world or more advanced BI. In the data quadrant, I think it's important to know that the data volume is ever growing. In fact, Aberdeen estimated that in U.S. businesses or organizations that the data volume grows at about 40% per year. So think about that, right? You're almost getting a 40 to 50% increase every year in your data volumes. So does your organization have a technology strategy that accounts for that growth, as well as an organizing scheme to manage it all effectively and efficiently? Regarding insights, we look at this in two dimensions. The first one is speed. We'll talk a little bit more about that on another slide. But the timely generation of your insights, your business insights, at a project level or a portfolio level, that will lead to a higher reward. So think of the insights dimension when we talk about speed in terms of real-time information and availability on very short decision windows, right? Those are the opportunities by which, if I get information timely, I can make a decision and take action that will reduce risk or lower cost. That's the first dimension when it comes to insights. The second one is context. And things to think about there are our informational sources and our data points aligned with our business objectives, right? That's always a fundamental when you're looking at developing scorecards or performance metrics or KPIs. And then finally, do you have a balance between your operational performance management reporting and monitoring, a balance of that with your foresight of your risks and opportunities? Those are the things that could happen to you out into the future, both positive or negative. So we look at that as part of the overall definition. This summer, ENFOS conducted a survey with about 200 remediation professionals, both from the customer side, that is the owner or the responsible party, as well as the consultants who are performing the work on their behalf. So we had about 200 people respond, and this question that we're showing here was a question about what are your most desirable features that you expect from a BI solution. The top three listed were standard reports and visualization, number one. Number two was dashboards, and number three was data presentations. Not too much of a surprise here for us. My comments or thoughts on this, if I look at ad hoc reporting, that's number 5 on the list, and it certainly got its fair share of marks, but it tells me, or at least it kind of proves to me, that our industry is still at a maturity level that's somewhat low compared to other business functions within our organizations, because the focus still, based on these survey results, is around automating standard reports and automating dashboards that bring value. So there's still some low-hanging fruit, using that term again, when it comes to the use of BI features, just around standard reporting, automation, data visualization, and dashboards. More advanced features like ad hoc reporting, also known as custom reporting, as well as data mining and predictive analysis, those are important, but our industry thinks that we have some more fundamental achievements to go after first. Because so many people, when they think about the definition of business intelligence, they think of dashboards. I wanted to show you a dashboard that was created in ENFOS. We won't spend too much time on this, but dashboards certainly are a major component of any BI solution. And typically, what's underlying this are your data sources, as well as a strong analytics. So there could be some algorithms, there could be some formulas that are rolling up data into a presentation layer, so that we can go to a screen or multiple screens and get a view at a lot of our primary metrics that we're looking at. And the types of visualizations are going to be variable by the tool that you use, but typically you'll have 50 or 60 different chart type or data visualization types that you can use to publish your dashboards to your end users. With ENFOS, as a commercial software company, we always think about new features in terms of what's the value proposition to the customer. If we talk about a new feature that sounds cool, but it doesn't necessarily yield a value proposition to a customer, we may not do it, right? So the software features that ENFOS adds to its product are always based on a value proposition. Business intelligence has its own unique value proposition. The quantitative assessment of that value is really up to each organization to define, and that will be based on their current level of BI maturity and their desired end state when it comes to BI. From a qualitative perspective, though, we've identified in a pyramid format what we think are the major elements of the value proposition. Starting at the bottom, BI needs to be customer driven. So we'll explore this in a little more detail on another slide, but the end users, right, of data, who ultimately are the decision makers and the people responsible for executing actions, are the ones that truly should drive the type of information and insights that come from BI. So it has to be customer driven. Faster insight. This is the speed that we talked about earlier. Now, granted, remediation projects have long life cycles, right? 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years or more in some cases, but we're making a lot of decisions along the way. So you might think that, well, we might make 1 or 2 key decisions a year. It really depends on the phase of the project, right? If you're on the early stages or early phases of a project, the decisions you make will impact future cost and risk significantly. If you're on the tail end of the life cycle phase, you're in long-term monitoring, O&M, something like that, then maybe not so much, even though we're seeing that a higher percentage of spend on an annual basis is starting to come from those tail end life cycle phases. So there still has to be opportunity to wring out some cost there and improve efficiency. But faster insight is part of the value proposition. Visual clarity is really kind of the packaging of those insights into usable visual charts, maps, graphs, and so on. It gives us visual clarity so that the end users can spot trends, they can spot anomalies, or they can test their theories and quickly see those results without going through tabular data sets. So visual clarity is a major element of the BI value prop. And then finally, at the top of the pyramid, it's cost reduction. We could also say risk mitigation there, but we're really trying to use BI to help us reduce the cost and mitigate the risks. Depending on your role, you will have different views of BI. They're typically broken down into these 3 categories. Hindsight, which is what happened. So that's basically reporting at the end of a period, right? We just closed Q3, and we need to do financial reports to show where we're at on our reserve balances, as an example. That's what happened. Or we're summarizing analytical data from a sampling event that just occurred. The next level is insight. Why did it happen, right? Why did we meet our goals or exceed them, or why did we not meet or exceed our goals? Why is this change order happening? Why are we asking for a reserve increase or replenishment? So the insight gets into the why. The foresight is really looking into the future then. And we always like to talk about that in terms of risks and opportunities, the downside and the upside. And we know that remediation projects are full of uncertainty. Therefore, we spend a lot of time in this foresight area. You know, what's going to happen based on the decisions that we've already made or the decisions that we still have to make. And BI attempts to package information based on roles. So some roles will manage all three of these areas, like project managers. If you're a project manager, you have to do performance management. That's hindsight. You have to always be evaluating your teams and your progress. Why is it happening? And then you're always looking out into the future. You know, what's the new estimate? What's my cost at completion or my estimate at completion? That's all foresight. The survey that I mentioned is summarized here. We had 30 or 40 questions, again about 200 remediation industry professionals respond to it. There's a few interesting stats here. About 65% of the respondents have not used BI as part of their job. So that tells me there's opportunity still to educate and improve the competencies that we have, right, as industry professionals. The majority, almost 9 out of every 10, believe that BI is a game changer or it's business critical or at a minimum very useful. So the perceived value is very, very high. When we segmented the results based on years of experience, we certainly found that our young professionals in our industry all believe that BI has a critical role for the future. So we always have to think about our retiring workforce, the skills that our younger workforce are bringing to us, and the tools they're going to need or want or demand to do their jobs. 83% believe the future BI is to improve insights and foresights, right? So, you know, people are looking for data to help them predict and manage what's going to happen in the future. And then 77% would significantly increase their use of BI if it was easier to access and the tools were readily available for them to use. Okay, so how is BI delivered throughout organizations? Generally, we bring it into 3 broad areas. Most of us today are still using spreadsheets or one-off analyses. Somebody gets asked the question, supervisor or a manager asks the question, and then, you know, the rest of us go run off and try to answer it, and we come back with spreadsheets, right? That's a typical one-off. That would be the most common delivery method of BI, certainly in our industry right now. The second one would be general BI applications, such as Power BI, Tableau, Spotfire, just to name a few. And those are commercial BI solutions that are generally connected to a business warehouse or to multiple data sources. And then third, and finally, there's embedded BI within a subject matter software application such as ENFOS. And that's exactly what ENFOS has done. So ENFOS is an environmental liability management platform for asset retirement obligations and environmental obligations and other environmental expenditures. It's built specific for that type of work. So that solution provider, or us, ENFOS, will, basically has embedded BI right into the application. Okay, so those are really different ways of delivering BI to end users. There's a general workflow associated with BI, and think of it really as there's two main players. These would be groups of people, but 2 camps, if you will. There's a consumer and there's a producer. The consumer is using the insights that BI is delivering to make decisions and perform their work. The producer is more of the data scientist type or developer, software developer, that is producing and helping the organization to deliver those insights in a very effective real-time way. So you've got consumers and producers. They always will start with a question. These are the business requests, right? There's a question. Sometimes the question is, how did we perform last quarter, right? Those are your typical update reports or financial reports. Other questions get into, risks and opportunities into the future. What about this area? Can we improve it? Can we optimize O&M, our O&M portfolio, and how? So there's business requests that really drive the BI engine, and those are generally from the consumers. The producers then are really responsible for making sure that the data streams, the data completeness, the granularity of the data, the quality of the data, the uniformity, and basically the preparation is completed, again, in the most effective way. The analytics have to do with the BI features, the charting, the graphing, the cross-tabbing, the algorithms, the formulas, the ratios. Those are really the analytics. And a lot of times the consumers know the algorithms, they just don't know how to code it, right? And I'm going to show you some examples of that here in a little bit. But to be able to explain the algorithm or the formula to the software developer or to the BI professional in your organization is definitely a skill that we all need to have if we're not BI professionals ourselves, if we're end users. And then the last element is the production. That's making providing the data, the information in the way the consumers need to consume it so that they can take advantage and leverage the information, make better decisions. So that's a typical workflow. So now we're going to shift gears. That was all kind of an overview from our perspective, working with our customers and the consultants that use ENFOS. I'm going to jump into some examples here, and so I shared these examples at our conference this summer, and I reframed a couple of them to go a little bit more detail because I only had 20 minutes at our conference and I have more time today. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper on a couple of these. But one or two of these are very simple, basic BI examples. And believe me, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of potential examples that are very simple, things that we could probably crank out on a spreadsheet quickly, but we can make them more effective if they're in an enterprise platform and they're always available. So we're going to go over a couple simple examples, and then I have some that are more moderate. I wouldn't call them complex, but more moderately complex that involve multiple stages of logic or algorithms. And hopefully these can generate some interest in the people that are attending here. If you take these back and talk to your organizations about them, you guys can use these. They're not proprietary because this is purely just looking at the logic behind them and the end result. And maybe the light bulb will go off. Really, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people to continue to think about the data that they have and how they can make it more useful to the decision makers. So our first example comes from a real-world example from one of our customers that's using our environmental data solution. And they have almost 24,000 monitoring wells on 1,000+ sites. So it's a lot. 23,548 is a lot of anything, but it's a monitoring well. So technically that's an asset, right? It's an environmental asset. They're used for your monitoring networks on your sites. We're typically, we've taken soil borings when those were installed. So we have soil data generally, and then we also get groundwater data, both groundwater level data, field parameters, as well as analytical samples that we use for reporting and assessment purposes. So this customer has a lot of monitoring wells. And they asked the question about the monitoring wells. And they basically were asking the question of, do we have monitoring wells out there in existence that really aren't being used, right? We've reduced the sampling requirements or monitoring requirements. Maybe they've been forgotten about, so they may create some risk. So the customer basically said, let's try to get our arms around the monitoring wells that we have spread out, through the United States, because it's a United States company. And in ENFOS, just like probably any other data management system, if you create, you create a sample location, you have the ability to put a status on it. Is it in use? Is it active? Is it inactive? Is it, dry? Has it been sealed and abandoned properly? Things like that. And, unfortunately, through the years, the customer and their consultants didn't really keep up with the status of each one of these monitoring wells. So when we queried them, they were basically all active, and we knew that they weren't. So we wanted to use BI to help answer the question, maybe we can make the software smarter and let the software, based on some other data sources and some logic, determine if that well is active or not. So we looked at two different scenarios. We looked at, have we had any field parameter data collection or any lab sample data collection from that well within the last 12 months, and then also within the last 24 months. And that was somewhat subjective. The customer made that decision to look at those two time frames. But you can see that in the last 12 months, about 6,500 of them are inactive over that 12-month period. If you go back to 24 months, about 4,300 of them were inactive. So, and because the customer is using ENFOS to manage their field data and their lab data, so it was easy enough to put a query in there to look at these logical time frames for activity. So that was the first step. And the second step was, okay, based on that level of activity, let's do a second tier analysis and determine out of the inactive wells, using the 24-month model, how many of those are on-site versus off-site? And that, you can see the summary of the results here. So they had about 3,000 of those inactives that were on their properties, and about 1,500 of them that were off-site. And they believed that those presented a much greater risk. So this company is using this for decision-making and for action. They actually are looking at strategies around not only improving their data management on their sample locations, but also a much more aggressive abandonment process and program when they need to decommission sample points. So that was a pretty basic example, but I just wanted to share that BI can be used for simple little problems like that, right? And that would have been easy enough to probably do on a spreadsheet, but if you have all your data there, including your sampling events and your locations and their date, boundary conditions, you can use that logic to make the machine smarter to determine what's active and what's not. The second example has to do with groundwater results from a subset of those sample points. And this is really for schematic purposes. Our industry is really, really good at creating analytical data tables, maps, isopleth or iso concentrations, and so on. What we don't do a lot of is looking at our analytical data across a portfolio of sites. So we worked with a customer to come up with some data visualizations and some background logic on looking at a group of sites or a portfolio of sites in a technical data context. So this is a simple example of a BI output. The x-axis is concentration in micrograms per liter of methyl tertiary butyl ether, or MTBE. So you can see it goes out to about 3,000 micrograms per liter. And the y-axis is the percent change from the last sampling event results to the previous sampling event prior to that. Okay, and again, this is just logic that the customer and ENFOS worked on to start looking at a portfolio of sites in a chart around their analytical data. They were using MTBE as kind of an indicator compound, and each dot represents a site. So you've got site 1 in the upper left-hand corner. So we can see that the well that had the highest MTBE concentration, which is what we used as the marker, increased by about 325%. So that increase in MTBE concentration raised a flag for that site and that well on that site. Now you can also then get a relative view, not relative, but an actual view of what the concentration was. So that was probably about 250 micrograms per liter, still above the standards, but not extraordinarily high. And then site 2 we labeled, there's about 20 sites that were in this test group. Site 2 we labeled is on the far right. Here you had a smaller percent change, but you still had an increase, right, of over 50% increase in concentration value from 2 different sampling events from the same well, but the concentration was much higher. So the customer is using this as a portfolio watch list where they've selected a particular analyte and made some logical assumptions around how they want to represent this data on a portfolio basis. So again, I would say another fairly basic BI visualization. Okay, now we're going to get into a couple that are a little bit more complex, and I'm turning now into financial data. So project cost forecasting or lifecycle cash flow forecasting. And you know, as many of you know, we have this kind of this dilemma in the remediation field about doing life cycle estimates, right? It's very difficult to estimate, first of all, because of the uncertainty around geology, chemistry, receptors, you know, and the various risks that we're dealing with, operational issues at the facilities we're working on. But we always have a curiosity and a business need to know how well are we forecasting. So this was an assessment with a set of data from a customer over almost a 10-year period of time. So what I'm showing here is a typical, this is a portfolio, so it's not a single site. It's a group of sites that are known liabilities that have a probable and estimable forecast associated with them as of the start of 2008. So this is basically what the cash flow forecast was for all of their sites in 2008. Now, they had a policy not to reserve any further than 2016 at that time, but that's a policy issue. This could have been, just technically could have, you know, extended until the last cash flow forecast. But you can see in 2008, during that year, they thought they might be spending, you know, around $18 million. When they did their forecast in 2008 for 2009, they thought it was around $16 million, and then there was a big drop-off. So 3 years out on their estimating horizon, 2010, it was around $10 million, and so on. Okay, so it's a cost curve looking at the liability projection made over multi-years back in January of 2008. So we had all this information for all these years after that, and we created a visualization that layered in each year's reforecast from the same project portfolio, right, through time. And this chart gets busy, but if you look at that orange line, that's the same line we looked at before. That was the estimate made in 2008. The green line is the estimate that was made in 2009. The blue line in 2010, and so on. So these are the data points of their rolled up life cycle forecast for their most likely scenario. The bar, the gray bar, represents the actual expenditures on those sites to reduce the liability or manage the remediation. So you can see the actual is the bar. And this, you know, if you really want to dissect a chart, you know, you could spend a lot of time talking about this. But what we did really to summarize it is we wanted to look at the average variances by year from the plan to the actual and compare that to some industry construction estimating standards. And the results of that are shown here for that portfolio. What you have here is year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. We just analyzed this for the first 5 years of the planning horizon. What this customer did over 8 years, they had an average variance of 29% in their year 1 estimate. So they actually estimated higher than their actual costs were in year 1 on average by 29%. Now, one of the things that we always tell our customers is we're not going to make a value judgment on this data. This is your data. We don't know if this is necessarily good or bad, right? As the enterprise software provider, we may have our suspicions based on our knowledge of their policy and procedure and goals, but overestimating by 29% in some organizations is not viewed as a good thing. I can tell you that, right? Some organizations it might be. Now, year 2, it starts to get worse, right? At least when you talk about we're spending more now, on average 19% than our year 2 estimate was. So the negative variance here is where our actual spend is higher than what we had planned. So the 3rd year out, this is always year 3. So if I'm doing my estimate right now for 2018, 2018 is year 1, 2019 is year 2, and 2020 is year 3. Okay? So that's how you have to look at this. The 3rd year out at any given annual estimate is what year 3 is, and year 4, and so on. But we're at minus 45% on average, and then the bottom falls out in year 4 and year 5. Okay? So through BI, this customer was able to analyze the data over 8 years of historical estimating records that all happen to be in their info system, as well as their actual expenditures, and they're able now to see that information and then start determining what they need to do to affect this, or at least tell the story on why this is happening. Is it policy or procedure driven? Is it a problem with their forecasting and estimating methodologies? Are they estimating on a low probability basis, right? So potentially, if you think about it as an S-curve, maybe they're taking the low estimates. So there could be many, many reasons why this is happening. Again, we're not here to make the value judgment, but what we would say is if nothing's changed in your policies and procedures and your estimating guidelines, if nothing's changed, when you look at 2020 or 2021 or 2022, you're probably way off, right? Because your historical performance shows that on average. So that was an example of lifecycle forecasting. I got one more example. This is what we call the Financial Performance Index, and it's an algorithm-based methodology. And we just didn't make it up. It actually mimics or follows your standard cost performance index methodology that you see in general project management textbooks or guidance documents. So ultimately, this Financial Performance Index looks a lot like and functions a lot like the Project Management Cost Performance Index, where you're measuring earned value as well as actual cost to determine if your project is on track or off track. So we use the standard methodology that's generally accepted, and we've applied it to the remediation world. Because there are some differences in how this work is estimated and performed. So we start with step 1, which is coming up with the ratio called cash efficiency. Cash efficiency, it's a simple mathematical formula. It takes the estimate to complete that you made at the beginning of the year, subtracts out your re-estimate at the end of the year, right, for those future years, and divides that by the spend that you had during the year. Okay, so the ETC is estimate to complete. 1 is at the start of the period, 2 is at the end of the period. A little example here just to try to clear this up. Let's say that at the start of 2017, my estimate to complete was $100,000. Now when I'm reforecasting for 2018 forward, my new estimate to complete is $90,000. During the year, I've spent $20,000. So now my cash efficiency is 0.5 or 50%. That means for every dollar I spent, I reduced the estimate to complete by 50 cents. Okay, so 50%. 100% or 1 cash efficiency means for every dollar I'm spending, I'm reducing my estimate to complete by in an exact amount. For every dollar I spend, my forecast estimate to complete also goes down by $1. So that's step 1, cash efficiency. Cash efficiency as its own is a very good metric for environmental remediation programs to be measuring and managing, particularly through their BI tools. This is a dashboard type ratio that can be displayed graphically. Okay. What we did through 3 different sets of data, we said cash efficiency, that ratio, has to vary through the phase of a project or through the life cycle phases of the project based on certainty and uncertainty. So we actually assessed this and proved this out. We were really trying to see, you know, for 3 customers, are there some trends there? And we found out exactly what we thought, that during the assessment and remedy selection phases, cash efficiency is usually in the negative, right? That means we're increasing or replenishing our estimates at a rate greater than we're spending. Again, not making a value judgment here. There are good reasons for that. Sometimes it's because we're doing our estimates on a stage gate basis. Other times we're not estimating for future phases until we have a higher level of certainty on the assessment and site characterization and the remedy selection. So there's reasons for this, but the math proves this out. When I get into remedy implementation and O&M, my cash efficiency finally gets above 0, which means that I've got a reserve decreasing, right? If I'm using my estimate to complete to build my reserve. And then when I get out into my closure phases, the cash efficiency goes above 1, which means that my reserve balance is decreasing at a rate greater than my spend, right? So you've got different areas and zones here. So what we can do with this cash efficiency by phase is you can model a portfolio, right? You can use your historical performance to model your portfolio in terms of what's going to happen in the future. So step 2 and step 3 of this multi-step algorithm uses some additional ratios. The performance adjusted estimate to complete basically says that my real estimate to complete, what I'm estimating, right, that I show on my project plan, I really need to adjust those based on the cash efficiency that I've selected for that phase. So we can adjust the estimate to complete based on the cash efficiency. That's step 2. And then step 3 basically says, okay, I have an estimate to complete. I have a performance adjusted estimate to complete. And now I want to compare the ratio of those 2. That performance index is exactly like CPI on a earned value basis for project management. And it results in a performance index that you can apply to every single project in your portfolio. Okay? So it should look familiar. Anything above 1 is trending in a positive direction. Anything below 1 in red here says that I'm still replenishing at a greater rate than I'm spending. In other words, my estimate to complete that I have on record is probably not sufficient for where I'm at in this overall project progression. So we can use this at a portfolio level, and you can do other statistical evaluations here. you can look at the mean. You can look at this index by project type. Is it a mega project versus a small project, and do we have variances there? You can evaluate your portfolio by the phase that it's in, right? Because you're expecting your ratio to be in the red in your earlier phases. You're expecting your projects to be in the blue on your later phases, and you want to confirm that that's happening. So there's a lot of evaluation you can do with this. But this is another example, a little bit more complex, that we wanted to share with everyone around answering the questions about forecasting as well as using the index to help evaluate problem areas and deal with issues maybe more proactively than you might normally. So those are some examples. And with that, we're going to turn this over to Michael Douglas. Mike is the Director of Accounts for ENFOS, and he's going to facilitate the Q&A. And as I turn it over to him, I'm going to pull up some of these questions.
Thanks, Roger. So everyone, if you have any questions that you want to get answered while we're all here together, you can enter those in the chat panel and the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll answer what we can now up until the half hour, and then anything that doesn't get answered, we'll send you a follow-up email with the answer. But we do have a few questions that have come in here now. Roger, you ready to start? We can run through a couple of these and give some folks some time to enter some additional ones.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, do you see them, Mike?
Yeah, I'm getting ready to ask you. Right. So regarding the chart on cash efficiency, how are you seeing some companies do better than others at estimating costs early in the project? Specifically, what are some of the leading indicators?
Mm-hmm. Now, that's a great question, and it's actually, with cash efficiency, I find it somewhat difficult to measure one customer versus the next, and that's partly because there are different policies out there when it comes to their life cycle forecasting. And I think that the people that are on this phone call that have worked in this industry for a while realize that. I mean, we have some customers, and I know some companies in the industry would be what we'd say are highly funded. In other words, they've gone through some kind of a business acquisition or merger, and they were able to report and disclose costs that are more closer to a market value for their expected cash flows, right? So in that case, they might, let's say they're more well-funded, their cash efficiency ratios might be inherently higher than an organization that, say, is not well-funded. Maybe that their policy is that, for every dollar we spend each year, our plan is to replenish that in the reserve next year. So much of the cash efficiency has to do with a company's policy around reserve management and budgeting. Now, with that said, I think within an organization, though, if you've got a pretty consistent enforcement of that policy, then you can look at those ratios project by project to determine some relative nature of your performance within the overall portfolio. So it's more difficult to compare from company A to company B, but it's of very high value to compare project A to project B within the same portfolio. So a lot of it's policy driven, and I'll stop there on the answer for that one.
Well, and then the other question that I'm looking at is sort of a dovetail of that, and I think you answered it, but from a life cycle cost forecasting perspective, how do you think organizations could use these different percentages and ratios for better estimating in the future? It sounds like you're almost looking at the performance of individual projects within a portfolio and how they perform against each other.
Correct. Yeah, we're not we're not suggesting that a company use the performance-adjusted estimate to complete for budgeting purposes or even for reserve purposes. So we're not suggesting that. What we're suggesting is that you use this as a project management indicator on each project so that you can evaluate that in the mix of the rest of your projects. And let's just say that you're showing a negative, a below the line, like one of those red projects, right, where it was under 1 on the performance index. You may be expecting your projects that are in your site characterization or your remedy design phase to be showing a below 1 performance index, right? So we're, again, if you're in the closure or long-term monitoring phases, you would probably expect to be greater than 1. So the outliers or the problems are where you have situations that come up that don't meet your expectations. So if you've got an O&M project or a project in long-term monitoring that's showing a cash efficiency, a performance index much lower than what the mean is for all the projects in that phase, then you might have an issue. So that this indicator, this performance index, is an indicator to identify projects that you may need to look at more closely, right, as an executive management team or as a project management team. So these are really indicators to say, the numbers say there's a potential problem here. Now let's put our brain power on it and determine if it really is or not. And if it is, let's take action.
Yeah. By the way, if anyone, again, has any questions that they want to ask, we're going to wrap up here in 3 minutes, but you can enter those into the chat box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Roger, one of the other questions is, how are you seeing customers use these types of metrics, and while also leveraging their supply chain? So the environmental consultants that maybe work with them, how are they sort of collaborating on these metrics together to make better decisions about their business?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could talk a lot about that. I think that our industry is used to having scorecards, right? Performance scorecards. So if you're an environmental consulting company, and you work for a consulting company and you're one of many, working for your end customer, most of us have some kind of a scorecard or KPI system that our customer uses to evaluate where we stack up, right, against our competitors, right? Maybe sometimes you're all viewed as strategic consultants and you're partners and you work together, so I understand that as well. But the point is, if you have the right metrics or the right ratios and your BI tool is providing that in real time and it's transparent to what those goals and objectives are, or the KPIs, and they're aligned with the customer's goals and objectives, then having a scorecard at least tells you where you're at, right? So that you as a consulting company can focus in on your strengths and your weaknesses. You have to be careful with that, though, because I know that there are some customers that assign projects based on complexity of the project, because some consulting companies are better at managing more complex, diverse type projects than others, and vice versa. Some consultants and contractors are better at handling higher volume, repetitive type activities than other companies. So each consulting company is kind of geared up or structured to be a high performer at what they think their strengths are. So sometimes you have to be careful at comparing a particular metric or ratio from consultant A to B to C, just because of the distribution of the portfolio is different from the customer's eyes. But in general, knowing what the goals and objectives are, having metrics and KPIs and ratios and indices, some of which, like we've talked about, having those transparent and available to everyone in real time makes a big difference, right? Because now we're kind of all, marching to the same beat, if you will.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Roger. So we've got a couple other more questions, but in the interest of time and everyone's time who joined us today, I will go ahead and follow up through email for those additional questions. So a couple housekeeping items before we shut it down. As Chris mentioned at the beginning, we recorded the webinar today. Within the next couple days, everybody that registered, even if you weren't able to attend, will be receiving the video. Feel free to pass the video along throughout your organization or anyone else that you think could find some value in it. And if you're interested in having a follow-on discussion about anything that we discussed today, you could reach out to me directly. I know many of the people that joined today, so feel free to shoot me an email, michael@enfos.com, or you can call me 630-689-0220 extension 15, and I can facilitate that discussion. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Chris, thanks for hosting, and Roger, thanks for taking time to present your findings from that surveys today.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Until next time, guys.